Get started now. Welcome all of you again. Before we start, as in Oromo tradition, we start this gathering with Oromo elders' blessing. That's what the Oromos do. I think in many parts of the Ethiopian South also people do that. So we're going to start with that. And then, as you'll see in the schedule that you have, I will make some opening remarks, and also Mr. Clement, who made this event possible. I'll say something about that, and later we'll make also welcome notes. So before I start, I need two people from the audience to make that blessing. I think Guluma and Hussein will bless us.
Aye, Saxalam Borana, Shannon Sodo, Sanas Sodo, Shannon Gida, Wine the Gano, Shagano, Dabes of Living Out, or Lalama, Vegan Wakaye, few and Jokis in our bush, Chokarikas in our bush, Professor Hagan Mara. Well, the Nana would Woodana Jera. What am I doing? I would eat through one again. Gadanku Hagabin. Then you have said,
Duran Seti, Maka, Oda, Bostoni, Maganagan, Talisinja, Maganti, Senamadi, Akumagate, Makaslamati, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, Jegara. Ya Wak, Ya Rabbi, Oromo Tana, Rakina Biyan Vase, Akabi Yagamnu Biyagari, Ya Rabbi, Nubul Soms, Ya Rabbi Nubul Soms, Ya Rabbi Nutiga, Rakina Amna, Rakina Hain, Hana Sumatu, then that Nufur, Ya Rabbi Hay, Hanumuden Days, at the deity, Tinker, would never go to Namoligali, Alagari, Yoromoni, Woligalan, whatever legal, whatever top, whatever table Suma Anana. ورجعتي بيجك أمنا بيجتين يحلو الله حكك أمنا حكك خينك أمنا يبني على جل جرسيزني على جان تريلين ومن نقول حكك خينك جرت أركي أمتا جرتي ولي رلوها عنها قط يا ربي خيرين ديس هجادين ديتي تيتين جرتي بيجتين أمنا بيجتين نجان نقط بيجنجان نقط ركينا أمنا خنا ركينا خيتين جرتي دين ديس نفور سبحان ربي ذات المعصوم الحمد لله رب العالمين يا عزيز يا كريم بجنجان نقط
Okay, thank you, Guluma. Thank you, Sin. Before I start, I want to thank people who made this event possible. First of all, Mr. Clement, the director, executive director of CAR Center for Human Rights here at the Kennedy School. He is, I can say, he is really responsible for this event to be here at this venue. Today, as school is closed everywhere, every campus, every light is off, and it's because of him that we have this light, we have this place, and I really want to thank him on behalf of Oromo Studies Association. And also in all the logistics, he's a very able assistant, Eric Jenkins, who is not here with us today. Who kept me on my toes in the details of this. Those of you who are involved in any conference organizing, the details are, as you can imagine, from contacting the presenters and from the logistics, from all this, and he kept me on toe. What not to be stressed about during this day, so that I can stress leading to the event. He was very helpful in the logistics, and even though he's not here with us today, Charlie, I want to extend that thanks to himself through you. And I also want to thank people, presenters who are coming from far apart, from Sweden, from London, from Canada. People also from in the United States, from faraway states, who are here today to do this presentation and for their hard work on their papers. I really also want to thank them for that effort and for being here with us. After that, I want to say a few words about OSA. For those of you, I think most of you are familiar with OSA, but just for the record, for those of you who are not aware, OSA is the Oromo Studies Organization or Association, which was established about 25 years ago. We just celebrated the 25th anniversary of OSA, of scholarship, of studies on Oromo issues in particular, and on many issues on the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. The reason why OSA was set up, I don't want to get into that, because the founding fathers of OSA and mothers of OSA are here today, who envisioned this about 25 years ago. Because of that, today Oromo studies, it has become the mainstream in any very serious studies. As you can see, many PhDs are being produced. If you look at those PhDs footnotes, most of them have sourced the studies, the conference papers on OSA. Most of this thesis that I see now on Oromo. So thank you for that vision 25 years ago, and we have OSA for the last 25 years. OSA's work is a continuum of scholarship. OSA conducts 2 conferences in a year. One is a mid-year conference, and this is supposed to be a smaller conference, mid-year conference, and the annual conference, which attracts people again from around the world. And it's a big conference, and in this conference, papers are presented, and then we produce proceedings of those conferences, and that becomes the body of knowledge on Oromo and in general on Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. In addition to that, OSA also produces a peer-reviewed Journal of Oromo Studies. His able editor is here, and those of you who have tried to publish on that journal know how difficult it is to publish on Journal of Oromo Studies, peer-reviewed, well-respected journal that is available around the world in many institutions and libraries. And so that is a work, that's a product of OSA again. This is OSA, and again, for those of you who have that vision some 25 years ago and even before that, the reason why, some people may ask why Oromo studies, and that has its own history. I don't want to get even try to venture to explain that, because I'm not going to do full justice to that reason, because the founders are here. But just let me highlight. Before that, this emergence of Oromo Studies Association, the Oromo culture, the Oromo history was distorted for many reasons, political reasons, and to explain, the existence of that empire, and what we are talking about is human rights, democracy, and foreign intervention. In this conference, there was a movement of human rights, people yearning for democratic rights, and to suppress that, people have created all kinds of stories and all kinds of history on Oromo. Oromo is the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. If you don't address, some people say, this is an ethnic group organization. It's a narrow, and I can't see a broader vision when you are not addressing 50% of a country. That is, how many countries in Africa are 40 million? I mean, now the official statistics has it, if that's correct, about 40 million people are Oromos, and not studying about those people is not really addressing what is going on in the Horn of Africa. And I think a good understanding of the politics, the culture, and the history of those people, that big, population segment, is not understanding the Horn. in my opinion. So OSA has started this venture about 25 years ago, and the work is continuing. And today's conference is part of that work. And you'll see in this 2 days conference, and we will see a lot of illuminating papers, and it's with a continuum of that scholarship. And so I welcome you, therefore, to this conference again. And before I get off the stage, I want to welcome Mr. Clement, the Executive Director of the Carr Center in Human Rights, the Carr Center for Human Rights in the Kennedy School. I wouldn't say, try to say anything much about Mr. Clements. He's a human rights activist from the get-go, and he's an active human rights advocate, as you will see from his bio in the Carr Centers on the website. So he would like to welcome you again formally to the Kennedy School. The Kennedy School is the one that welcomed me about 17 years ago as a graduate school to Harvard, and still with that affiliation for 17 years. And I always thank the Kennedy School for making that happen to me, and for welcoming also OSA to this venue today. And
thank you, Hamza. As he said, I just wanted to say welcome to the Kennedy School, and to say that the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy is very happy to be associated with this gathering today. There were some obstacles to the university being closed today, but we managed to overcome most of those. And I want to congratulate you on the gathering today and the scholarship that you will hear in the next couple of days. I have to ask if any of you know Hamdessa Tuso, because he's the reason that when Hamza came to me that I had a sweet spot in my heart for the Oromo Studies Association. I taught conflict resolution with Hamdessa some years ago, and hoped I might have seen him here. But I'll be in contact with him now that I've kind of renewed the acquaintance. In reference to your number of 40 million, there are other ways you have arrived on the world scene as well, and one of them was that my daughter had been playing tricks with me and switched my cell phone to French. I think an indication that she wants to have a vacation in France. And in switching it back, I noticed that one of the choices of languages I could choose from was Oromo, which was quite interesting on the iPhone. So I think that's an interesting achievement. I wish you well in these 2 days, and please consider the Kennedy School a place where you can gather, a place where ideas are freely exchanged. We're not afraid of controversy here. We do ask that the differences of opinion remain civil and respectful. And with that note, I welcome you and wish you well in the conference.
Thank you. So as you can see from the schedule now, we will have Professor Guluma Gemeda to present his paper on the understanding the challenges the human rights and democracy in the Horn of Africa. The discussant for this paper would be Professor Mohammed Hassan.
Good morning. Since we are actually a small audience, instead of standing at the podium, I would like just to probably sit, if you don't mind. And I try to make my remarks as brief as possible, and leave some time for discussions, questions and answers. Thank you, Dr. Hamza and Mr. Clements, for warmly inviting us to this venue today. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the Oromo Studies mid-year conference at Harvard. That's a great pleasure for all of us. I'll start my remarks with a few notes. First of all, I would like to remind everybody, particularly those of you who don't know me much, I'm not human rights expert, although I'm scheduled to speak on human rights issues. I'm a historian. I study Ethiopian history, the Horn of Africa, and teach also African and African American history at the University of Michigan Flint. So, even if I'm not human rights expert, and since Dr. Hamza asked me to make a presentation and trying to fit into this theme, the theme of the conference, I've tried to look at some issues on human rights in a historical perspective in Ethiopia. And overall, in fact, also the Horn of Africa, but my focus is mainly on Ethiopia. So let me read some of my remarks. Human rights, or the right we have simply for being human. In fact, there are several, those of you who deal with this subject know that there are several definitions, but I take the simplest and probably that applies to all. So the rights that we have are for simply being human. And democracy, the second theme of this conference is a system of government where people participate in shaping the laws under which they live, directly or indirectly, and have the opportunity to elect their leaders as in free and fair elections are most essential for modern society. Human rights are natural and inherent and necessary for human dignity and existence. The basic concepts of human rights and the practice of democracy have evolved with human experience. Although both concepts are popularized only in modern times, they had actually existed or were practiced by many societies much longer. To some extent, each society had a norm or moral ethic to protect the basic rights of its citizens. Some aspects of these rights were developed, codified, and enforced through religious practices and through culture. Abuses were discouraged. Violators of human rights were penalized based on the established norms of society. Similarly, many societies practiced some form of democratic institutions that allowed their members to participate in political decision-making processes. The Oromo, for example, developed a complex system of democratic institution called the Gada system that we all know. Yet, many scholars trace the origins of the concept of modern human rights and democracy to Western culture. In fact, I will not get into all that debate here today. Whatever their origins, the importance of both human rights and democracy is widely recognized in modern times because their existence guarantees human dignity, safety, well-being, creativity, and economic prosperity. They promote peace and discourage conflict. During the last century, learning from the tragic consequences of 2 world wars and revolutions, nations have come together to create a global framework for the institutionalization of human rights. Now, at least some aspects of human rights are recognized as universal and are incorporated into the international treaties and multilateral agreements between nations and states. Such rights are also enshrined in many national constitutions. Human rights and democracy are not exactly the same. To some extent, human rights could exist in non-democratic societies as well. Democratic nations inform human rights laws and protect their citizens. And more importantly, in democratic societies, citizens themselves guard their rights against violators using democratic institutions. Unfortunately, in the Horn of Africa, irrespective of what political leaders in power claim, neither human rights nor democracy currently exist. Everywhere in the region, none of the incumbents, maybe I have to say, with the exception of maybe Djibouti, which is a small nation and doesn't have that much influence over what happens in the region. Everywhere in the region, none of the incumbent leaders came to power or through legitimate, peaceful transfer of power. All used violence, armed struggle or military coup to gain political power and continue to hold such position largely at least through the use of force. Also, the way they came to power matters for the respect of human rights and the development of a culture of democracy. How they behaved and still continue to behave after they took power matters even more. Despite the making of constitutions and with specific guarantees for the respect of human rights and the commitment of to regular democratic elections, at least none of the leaders have so far enforced human rights laws or are on any credible road towards democratization in the region. The states who signed international, I mean in the whole, the states who signed international human rights treaties, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, have yet to implement even the limited part of these agreements that they had endorsed or signed. Nor do they implement their own constitutions, which incorporate human rights treaties. In fact, the leaders in the Horn of Africa are among the worst violators of treaties on human rights. Many credible media reports, the US State Department annual human rights report, international organizations such as the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, independent and groups advocating human rights such as the Oromo Support Group, OCG, the director here with us, Dr. Trevor Truman, the Human Rights League of the Horn of Africa, for the Horn of Africa, also the director of this organization, Mr. Wakesa, with us today, and other national organizations like the Ethiopian Human Rights Council attested to the widespread violations of human rights throughout the Horn of Africa, and particularly, in fact, in Ethiopia. The failure of these governments to uphold human rights laws has contributed to an ending conflict and the displacement of thousands of people going into exile and expansion of refugee camps all over the region. Their failure has also contributed to lack of governance, of good governance, stifled the process of democratization and the creation of a democratic society in the region. In this presentation, I'll attempt to discuss the challenge to human rights and democracy in the Horn of Africa in historical context. Here, the Horn of Africa is also Northeast Africa, includes the states, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, North and South Sudan, now in fact, 2 nations. Although my remarks cover all of them, it's for the sake of time, I'll focus only on Ethiopia, which in fact has contributed significantly to the major conflicts and the violations of human rights in the whole region. First, I'll review the historical and cultural record on violence and show how differences were handled, conflicts were managed and resolved. The purpose of doing this is to investigate how history and culture shape contemporary human rights issues. Second, I'll point out the intellectual approach to the political crisis in Ethiopia, particularly by Abyssinian scholars and EPRDF leaders. Third, I'll consider the nationalist response to the historical injustices and the political repressions and its implication for human rights and democracy in the Horn of Africa. Besides geography and environment, common environments, the states in the Horn of Africa share common problems. which apparently require common solutions. During the last half century, they have all experienced environmental change, devastating famines, human dislocation, and overflowing refugee populations. The regime in each country contributed to human misery by encouraging and providing sanctuary to dissident political groups, not so much that they supported the cause of those organizations, but just to undermine their neighbors. Such actions further aggravated the internal internal crisis, and contributed to cross-border conflicts and political instability, and widened the social and economic crisis. Human rights abuses are rampant in each country, and the democratic institutions have not taken root. The question is, what's unique about the Horn of Africa that makes it prone to persistent violence, political and social instability? Why does the region with the oldest tradition of state formation face nationalists seeking self-determination and the threat of state disintegration? To understand the situation, of the Horn of Africa, first let's look at the African context in general. Modern African states were created as a result of colonial projects. Although some of them were built on pre-colonial structures, European nationalism brought various ethnic groups under the same administration and briefly imposed the European system of government, legal institutions, official language, modern education, labor regimes, and economic production and exchange that undermined inherited African culture, political system, and social institutions. After about 8 decades of European rule, Africans gained their independence, ending colonial administrations, and are now rebuilding their cultures. But when colonial rule ended, almost 50 years ago, in some cases, in fact, only recently, Africans were left with state boundaries, new national flags, limited system of transportation, and modern educational institutions and administrative structures that rarely resembled the pre-colonial experience. Despite unstable and ill-defined boundaries, post-colonial African states held together remarkably well, even where the new national boundaries split the same ethnic group into two or more states. This was possible because post-colonial African nations made deliberate decision to retain boundaries arbitrarily designed or drawn by European powers for colonial interests. But the retention of such colonial boundaries also came with a heavy cost for the cultures and social organizations of indigenous people. The rational nature of state boundaries affected social cohesion, hampered the emergence of nation states in post-colonial Africa. Hoping to suppress cross-border ethnic ties and to facilitate nation building, African leaders, post-colonial African leaders, spanned ethnic associations and common cultural expression, but they failed to overcome the underlying ethnic tension, which continued to weaken the political system and nation-building efforts. Instead, their efforts contributed to the rise of military dictatorships, numerous conflicts, weak or non-existent civil societies, and widespread abuse of human rights. Although all post-colonial African states were troubled by the persistent ethnic conflict and bad governance, the Horn of Africa inherited a unique set of problems, more complicated than the rest of Africa. Unlike other African regions, the peoples in Northeast Africa experienced colonial rule somewhat differently. Here, the European experience was mediated through local forces which shaped political development differently. Instead of colonial powers coming from a distant land or departing, at least symbolically or at least partially later, to allow the people to establish their own government. For many people in the Horn of Africa, there was no break from the colonial past. Oppressive, dominant political regimes never left, nor did the successful form of political system, nor did the successful political, nor did the reforms of political systems and democratization took place in this region. Instead, the region has suffered from chronic, deep-rooted conflicts which are still unresolved. Most people in the Horn of Africa still suffer from small-scale and extended long-term conflicts that disrupted many people's life. Unending political and social crises still characterize the landscape all over the Horn of Africa. There are numerous factors contributing to this unique situation in the Horn of Africa. Understanding the challenge to human rights and democracy in the Horn of Africa requires careful analysis of the region's history, cultural diversity, environmental and geopolitics, competing nationalism or nationalist aspirations of the people. Also, human rights violations and lack of democracy can be attributed to bad governance. The latter itself, the bad governance itself is rooted in the tradition of violence and political culture, violent political culture and long history of domination in Ethiopia. Exploring the history of the region, therefore, helps to understand the current situation. That's actually where I go to history and use some examples. Although those of you who are familiar with the history of the region, and particularly Ethiopia, in fact, you see more violence than peace throughout history. It's not something actually new. That's not to suggest that or to absolve the current leaders who are unable to bring any peace. The history is, in fact, full of that. So I use some examples. I don't know how much time I have to get into more detail, but probably if you don't have time, I could summarize those points orally, and then maybe go to some discussions. Was keeping some time for us. Dr. Hamza. Okay. Most scholars of the Horn of Africa are focused on a single state and ignored to explore the common characteristic of the broad political history of the region. Addressing this gap, recently scholars have started investigating the political history of the whole, the region, as a whole, instead of Ethiopia, Sudan, or doing each separately. Richard Reid, maybe some of you have seen his latest book, Frontiers of Violence in Northeast Africa, for example, covers the broader geographical spectrum of the whole during the last 200 years. And in fact, unlike other scholars, Reid actually takes the question of violence, looks at violence and how violence, the history of violence in the region actually shaped the political processes. So in most cases, actually, scholars looked at how this diverse, multi-ethnic society lived together, or the positive aspect of it. But in reality, it's actually more of clashes and conflicts over time. So by looking at violence, you can maybe understand a different side of the history of the region, and Reid has done that. in his book. He shows how focusing on violence is vital to understand the modern history of Northeast Africa. He writes, more broadly, Ethiopia and its immediate neighbors constitute a region which may be described as a mosaic of fault lines and frontier zones. In fact, another scholar who has looked at the Horn of Africa as a whole in the last few years is Mr. Lenj Oleta. All of you, most of you, if you are familiar with his work, but particularly the Horn of Africa as a common homeland. His book that came out in 2004 looks the situation in the whole region. Also, in fact, his basic arguments could be debated, but there is one important insight that Mr. Leta includes in his book, and that's how the Horn of Africa, in spite of, in fact, the overall African colonial experience, how the Horn of Africa, the region, in fact, could be looked at different from other regions of Africa. This is the region where part of the problem comes not only really from European colonialism, but an African, dominant African empire building. And in fact, in this case, it's just Ethiopia, the Abyssinian state, expanding to the south and to include the modern political boundary of Ethiopia, and also on the other side, Sudan, now in fact in northern Sudan. Also, in fact, Sudan had actually came under European colonial rule, but there are still, in fact, a lot of continuities in the Sudanese history. Sudan itself was under the Turco-Egyptians before the British came in the late 19th century, and when the British left, the new Sudan was established, that including, in fact, more territories than the older Sudan, the pre-colonial Sudan, in fact, had. And more or less the pattern of the political structure in the Sudan, where a long period of conflict existed between North and South. Now the South becoming independent, and still, in fact, a major crisis in the West is in Darfur, has more or less, in fact, something that parallels the Ethiopian situation. So these are the two dominant nations contributing to the major conflicts in the region, and also, in fact, acting as a dominant power over the surrounding areas for a very long time. And one, in fact, very interesting aspect of the situation in the Horn of Africa is also Africa as a whole, we know, had its own problems, and is still, in fact, experiencing that. But it's in the Horn of Africa that over the last 30, 40 years that we have seen a continuous period of conflict, which is, in fact, to some extent, which is still going on. Internal to one state, in Ethiopia, until 1991, is the Ethiopian government in Eritrea, and other nationalist organizations fighting against the government. Sudan had also, in fact, the same kind of problem. And since its independence from British rule in 1956, Sudan had also experienced a similar problem with the South, which is now independent, and now, in fact, remains with Darfur, which is another major area. Across borders, the nations in this region has also, in fact, fought some of the major wars. Ethiopia several times fought with Somalia, and Ethiopia again with Eritrea in 1998 to 2000, and still, in fact, unresolved situation. So, in a way, although Africans have experienced violence over the last 40, 50 years, the Horn of Africa had experienced it even more and more complicated. And surprisingly, this is a region which at least two of the dominant states claim to be the oldest, maybe among the oldest states in the region, at whole, counting many thousands of years of state formation, but unfinished process of state formation, where still, in fact, state is being threatened. The stability and the survival of the state is being threatened. Even in more than, in fact, the African nations, which were kind of in a very ad hoc way put together by the colonial powers. That's, I think, one issue that maybe we have to look at the Horn of Africa separately from the situation in other parts of Africa and the problems with human rights and democracy. Next, actually, I'll look at Ethiopia in more detail and go into, as I've said, in fact, earlier, I look at Ethiopian history, how, in fact, violence has dominated its existence for many years. And it's not only violence, but the problem is actually the inability of the state system, and also, in fact, also the society as a whole, to overcome or to the failure to create a mechanism to handle differences. If you look at major challenges to the states in Ethiopian history, here I'm focusing, in fact, Abyssinia, the core of the Abyssinian state, before its expansion and including other territories in the southeast. If you look at that history for a long time, the political leaders, in fact, had never succeeded in treating or handling dissent. Their only solution, almost all the time, is actually the use of force. It's a total elimination of someone who challenges the state, rather than actually really finding a way to handle difference and to compromise. That culture never took place in Ethiopian history. It's not only, in fact, the state, but the church, the Orthodox Church, is one of the oldest in church history in Africa. But in spite of this very old history, even the church had never succeeded in finding a way to handle difference, to compromise. Whenever they had a debate, actually the clergy, the Ethiopian clergy, whenever they had a debate, the debates very often ended in violence. The winning party would be physically abused, would be imprisoned, would be tortured by the church leaders, and sent into exile or killed. This has been the pattern for many years. So both the state and the church, these are the two major institutions of the society, had never developed a culture of tolerance and way of handling differences and making relationship better with anyone which opposes either the church or the state. That's what we find all the time. And I take two just very randomly, actually, because you can take any example from any time period. I take an example, maybe some of you are not familiar with, way back in the 15th century. There was a small, this is actually involved in the case that involved the church, a small group of people within the Orthodox Church disagreed with established teaching of the church leaders. This was led by a clergy called Stephanos. And the leader of this group and his followers were immediately cast out from the community to eliminate them practically. But what happened was the group, also very small, they survived. They didn't go away. They were well sent to the wilderness, but they actually turned it into an opportunity to even create a stronger cohesion, and in fact to make their teaching even more attractive. When the leaders, in fact, the church leaders found out that this group was not actually really perishing quickly, they turned it to the state and put a lot of pressure to bring these people to be officially tortured and in fact physically eliminated. So the leader of this group actually appeared 3 times at the court of the emperor. And all sorts of accusations were built around that. One, in fact, the leader was actually teaching young people not to respect Saint Mary. And Mary, in fact, being one of very important Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, that disrespected the king. When he was brought to the court and then answered these charges, in fact, the guy was defiant, and they said, well, I'm a religious leader, I don't have nothing, I have nothing to do with the worldly affairs, I don't answer to worldly issues, so he refused to admit and apologize. So he was tortured a couple of times, and eventually, in fact, he was sent into exile, where he eventually died. His other senior leaders of his group, in fact, faced the same fate. They were sent into different places in very remote mountain tops, where they would have very little or no contact with the other people. And many of them died there. And a few survived, and one even traveled to Egypt. He later came back, tried to reconcile and reintegrate. But in fact, their opponents were never satisfied until, in fact, they got rid of that group. It's called the Stephanite heresy, as it's called. So it's not very well known history in Ethiopia, but it's an example of how dissent, differing opinion is treated. There is no way of, in fact, reconciling this. I take another example from the 17th century, where, in fact, the church leaders debated on the nature of Christ for several reasons, and each one of those conferences eventually ended in violence, and the losing party was tortured, imprisoned, and eventually died there. I take another example from the 19th century to show over the period of time and how, in fact, nothing has changed, and this is, in fact, an example from the period of Emperor Johannes. His policy towards Muslims in central Ethiopia is well known. I think Wollo, it was very brutal. I ordered them to convert to Christianity. If they didn't, they left the region. Some of the leaders actually converted for convenience. They have to keep their property, their position. So that's, I think, well known. The other one is, in fact, was not satisfied actually with the differences within the church. He wanted to make, in fact, his official, the favored doctrine, the official doctrine of the church. So he brought all the churches and political leaders together to accept that. And if they didn't, in fact, they were treated in the same way as the Muslims were. And in fact, writing about this, as Megorgis, most of you know this, says, all districts of the Habasha were haunted by war. Human blood was shed in every river. And this was told as a glorious thing by contemporaries. Actually, those who did this celebrated it. They said that was a big achievement in coercing and forcing those who refused to accept their line, and eventually, in fact, they got almost everybody in line. So that's, I think, this is the background that we did. Well, coming forward very quickly, now I see, in fact, I have only 5 minutes. Coming forward, how does this relate to the current situation and the current political leaders? Well, at least all the leaders, including the military, since the revolution, claimed to have given up the past and waged war on the past, and declared a total departure from. And particularly those in power right now, actually, well, they have their own fascination with Marxism, which they have given up for liberal democracy now. But in reality, I think maybe if this is not what's officially admitted and implemented, that cultural background and the lack of tolerance and the violence, the culture of violence, it plays a big role. So even if in fact ideas, modern ideas, concepts of democracy, respect for human rights, all these in fact can be recited by everybody, but in practice the old culture of the of violence and intolerance, in fact, is out there. I just maybe I forgot one. I wanted to mention actually one, because not maybe by most of us here, but by some other people, mostly Abyssinians, actually have some special respect, admiration for Milik, for the same reasons that we actually really dislike and objected to all that image of Milik, because we know what he or his soldiers did to the Oromo and other people in the south. But there are people who endear him. But even Milik, in fact, was so much admired by the Abyssinians, in fact, has his own intolerance. And he started, for example, there was one example to use, when he came out of prison, Todros prison in 1865, and he has a challenger in Shah to reclaim his position as a successor to the king of Shah. A man called Bezabi, who was appointed by Todros, actually challenged him, but he gave up very quickly and he submitted. But when he was submitted, Milik was not happy, because he didn't eliminate him physically. So he quickly assembled a group of loyalists to pass a verdict on him. And not surprising, actually, the loyalists quickly decided that this person should be killed, should be murdered. And so that happened. Bezabi was killed, and in fact, when he was killed by a firing squad, it was reported that actually, because of the excessive gunpowders that they used, his body was burned alive. And this was what religionist, the Al-Gash, said. Brute you were, a brute is assigned to you. There you are, put on fire like a Christmas bread. The Amharic version is, አንተም ጨካኝ ነበርክ ጨካኝ አዘዘብህ እንደገና ዳቦ እሳት ነደደብህ. So opponent is, in fact, that's the fate of an opponent in the Ethiopian culture and politics, and not much has changed, unfortunately, really to this day. Okay, do we have 2 minutes?
1 minute.
Okay, I can do it. Okay, well, I didn't talk of the other part of my presentation. The second part, as I've said, is the approach to the current crisis. What is it? And particularly, I think, from the government's point of view, I'm talking still focusing on Ethiopia, the government point of view, and most of the Abyssinian scholars, intellectuals, look at it in two ways. Maybe from the intellectual's point of view, I think there is a tendency that this is something, the crisis is something actually invented, created by elites of different national groups, maybe including themselves, who are vying for political power, control of political power and resources. So it's maybe an elite issue, an elite problem. When you press it harder, I think I think the response is, it's not actually really an elite of maybe an Amhara or other groups that they are talking about, to whom some of them kind of claim they have the right to, but the other elites, the Oromo and others who are just aspiring or want to share their power. I think that's it's not the case. The problem is, I think this is a misdiagnosis of the problem. The problem is much deeper. It's in fact affects many people, the whole society, and the more I think the problems are treated as a problem of the society and maybe a need for the solution is, I think, the better. I get closer. On the other hand, the people in power, in fact, they seem to at least claim that they understand.
The role of a discussant is, of course, first to read the paper and then critique that paper. I didn't have the opportunity to read the paper, and all what I have really to say is a few words. 15 minutes is like a year for me, so I'll try to shorten it as much as possible. Dr. Guluma raised many questions, of course, many problems in the Horn of Africa. One is the absence of the rule of law in the region. If you travel, if you read anything, whether it is the Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, the case is in many ways really very, very similar. If you ask a simple question, why is this? Are the Africans incapable of governing themselves? If you read that question, it really comes down to this point. Every government in the region talk about democracy. Probably, let me say, the Eritrean government does not talk about democracy. At least they are honest at that level. They oppress their population, but at least they have the courage to say we are not practicing democracy. In the Sudan, it is Islamic democracy. I don't know how Islam can be a democracy. It's strange. In Ethiopia now they say we are democratic federal. It's only on paper, as Guluma rightly said. In fact, there is no political culture. There is no political culture in the region. And they imported concepts from outside. The concepts of democracy that were imported were really shallow. Could you import foreign concepts and make them work? I mean, in the last 50 years, all across Africa, societies that really borrowed foreign ideas, foreign concepts, they have never been successful in terms of democratizing. Democracy has to develop from within the culture of a society. When they were drafting the constitution of the TPLF, let me say TPLF because for the last 21 years, it is the TPLF that has been running the Ethiopian state. They never seriously considered including indigenous institutions, democratic institutions. They brought experts from outside, and they did not really take. In fact, one simple question, did they ever consider using Gada democracy as a background? And if anyone talks about Gada, the Abyssinian elite will rise up in armies. They think, it's not a democratic, and for us it was probably the best form of democratic system. And unless, whether it is in Ethiopia, in the Sudan, anywhere, unless societies really go back to traditional system, democratic system, building a better future is really not easy, as I say. Why do I make this pessimistic thing? Currently, I am teaching a graduate seminar on the Horn of Africa, Sudan, and the countries I have mentioned. And we discuss this problem endlessly, read so many, and the one lesson I got from this is really, it is about time societies in the region, and especially we the Oromos, instead of just talking about Gada, going back and practicing it. The core of Gada was really consensus, listening to each other. My way or highway had never been part of Gada. Now what is our politics? It is my way or no way. What destroyed the OLF? It is precisely this idea. Why do people don't come together? Simply because the element of tolerance is not there. You listen to me. If you don't take my idea, you become my enemy. How do you expect to develop a democratic culture on the basis of that kind of mindset? We have to move away from that mindset. Under the Gada system, they used to say whenever human beings discuss issues, it is natural, people get angry. You know what they used to say? How good to do, being, let things cool, and then people come back, discuss, settle, and then reach a consensus agreement. That element is not there, and I think we have to go back to that. The second point I got from what Guluma said is, there is really no civil societies. Everywhere in the Horn of Africa, civil societies are destroyed. In the Western culture, the basis of democratic practice is civil societies. Civil societies are not allowed to flourish, and no culture of tolerance. And then the second element is there is no respect for human rights, and it is across the board. I would only like to add one or two points to it. Human rights violation in the Sudan has really been exposed extensively, especially about Darfur. There is very serious conflict, probably you may not know, in the Noba Hill areas. There is a very serious conflict currently going on between the south and the north, and within the north itself. But on the whole, because of Western media interest in the Sudan, if you remember 2007, 2008, there was a great deal of interest on these issues, and the situation in the Sudan was really exposed. There is a little bit of respect for human rights in Somaliland. The reason is very, very simple. Since 1991, Somaliland declared independence, and all what they have really done is to go back to the old way of living together, which was based on consensus. It's not smooth, it's not easy, but the system is more or less working for them. Is it good for our people there? It is not good, no doubt, because Somaliland is under the control of the Wayanis. The Wayanis could do anything to their enemies anywhere. Otherwise, at least in Somaliland, because the leaders listen to the voice of the people. Democracy entirely means people in position of leadership listening to the voice of the people. At least in Somaliland, that is the case. And the southern Somalia, everybody knows, is in anarchy. And there is a very serious human rights abuses in Ethiopia. And we all are going to hear more about it. But the tragic aspect is that human rights abuse is really not exposed. Now, let us ask ourselves, why is the human rights violation in Ethiopia not exposed fully as it is? Did the Oromo diaspora come together to expose it? Did the Ethiopian diaspora, the Amara diaspora, the others? You know, human rights violation in that country, of course, it is targeted on the Oromo, but all other people in that country are affected by human rights violation. Why I say it is targeted on the Oromo, I'll deal with that aspect tomorrow when I make my presentation. But the diaspora here, because the diaspora is so much divided among themselves, the Oromo diaspora, are we united? If we are divided on the political issue, can't we agree in terms of exposing the unbelievable human sufferings our people are suffering daily? Can't we come on that? If we don't come together on that issue, who is going to do the job for us? After all, the people from Ethiopia, you know, we don't have influential friends among the Western politicians. We don't have contact with the media. And generally, it is either the politicians or the media that exposes. And we don't have numerical, the number. We don't have intellectual power. We don't have financial power. If we have financial power, we can simply advertise it on television or in the New York Times, and then the issue will be exposed. At least the point I'm really trying to say is very, very simple. The diaspora, whether it is the Oromo diaspora or other Ethiopian diaspora, they have not done their homework. They may quarrel in million ways, waste their mega energy on that, but if they come around on the human rights issue, they can probably expose that government. But the focus is more on politics. Everybody talks about politics. Politics is very divisive. Can't one agree on the issue of human rights? And this is the point I want to throw at you. And the final point I want to mention is, toward the end, Guluma said, the current government in Ethiopia, its policy is very similar to that of the Derg. I would like to add, probably it may even be worse. Why do I say this? You may not believe this. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with my sisters. I come from the eastern part of Harar, about 150 miles southeast of the city of Gemeda. My sister came to the nearest town, Badano, about 3 hours walk. And thanks to modern communication, she has cell phone. She said in our village, the village I come from, the Kabale Association has a cell phone. The government gave him the cell phone. Anyone who comes to Lagamanyo, where I come from, anyone who comes, the Kabale Association has to know, has to record. If a known person visits that area, he has to report on, which really means if every Kabale Association outside in the entire country is like the village I come from, and I doubt if it is very different, which means there had never been a government like this one that controls population all the way to the village level, which means the hand of this government really reaches much more than that of the Derg, and they tightly control the population, and we have to keep that point in mind. And I am done, and I call on you to open.
Thank you so much. I think we had an excellent paper, as most of you can attest to, agree with me. And also an interesting follow-up discussant in his own right, another paper probably. And so I'm going to open it. We are always with OSA paper presentation. We run over a little bit, so I think I'm going to give about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, and then we're going to move to another topic which is very interesting also. I think just to say one word with what Professor Muhammad said, these kinds of forums that we can continue holding are going to serve the other, to make these issues come to the forefront. We may not be able to write the editorials of the Washington Post or New York Times, but these kinds of things, this is on the internet now. Everybody can listen to, and activists can tune to. I think this is a deeper historical presentation of the whole region, and this is what we can do as a diaspora. So we just need to keep on doing. The OSA continues to do the work that it's set up to do for the last 25 years, and I hope there are a lot of other sister organizations, other Ethiopian scholarly institutions which are going to be doing the same thing, and it's a scholarly, at the same time I would say it's an advocacy work. There is no scholar that survives in an ivory tower. So I'm going to open that for discussion after reflecting on that. If there is any question, it's a very short question. We'll end with a question mark. I don't expect another paper. I know these are very vibrant, participants, and I know most of you. So questions targeted to the presenter. Yes.
Just a small point. You raised the question of nationalist aspiration, making human rights violation a kind of vicious circle in Ethiopia. I want you to separate, in a way, the nationalist aspiration, that of, say, the Oromo or the Somalis that are fighting against the Ethiopian state. That aspiration as a factor in causing human rights violation and that of the state, because I don't really equate them. I don't know if you have equated them, but other writers do that. The problem of human rights in the Horn of Africa, the problem of peace in the Horn of Africa is blamed not only on the state, but also on the other actors. And I don't see that as a fair way of dealing with the situation. The other thing which came to my mind is also the role of the Ethiopian state in human rights violation. On the Horn, you took the Sudan also, but I see, for example, for the dissolution of the state of Somalia, because of it, I take the Ethiopian state, as responsible. I have my reasons. I cannot say it now. That should be written down and presented. So, how do you see, compare, these states that are Somalia, Ethiopia, in being the core cause of human rights violation, the state itself?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Makria. Just as a matter of clarification, for Zain was a little bit rushing and didn't really explain what I meant, and I'm glad you raised this issue. What I meant and what I wrote here, which is going under revisions right now, so it's not something complete, is that I didn't mean to equate the nationalist challenge causing human rights violation. The challenge, obviously, in fact, is met with violence, and whenever there is violence, there is conflict. It's not easy for the respect of human rights. Innocent people could be caught up in the crossfire. But in a way, I think I'll put the responsibility on the government and on the nationalists who challenge this, particularly from the point of view of the cause that they are advancing, would ultimately, if realized, would actually bring about more democratization. Also, in fact, we cannot be sure how much democratic all these nationalist leaders would be if they get to power. But I think the assumption is that fighting against injustice and ultimately, in fact, if they get the position of power, would hopefully really perform better. Well, I may not get into debates with anybody on this, but I think we have to be a little bit careful and wait and see what exactly they would bring if at all they get to power, particularly given the TPLF's experience. TPLF, in fact, as everybody knows, fought against the Derg to the end, and advancing a cause. But the moment they go to power, in fact, all that cause disappeared, and all we saw is, in fact, more or less the repetition of more or less their type. So that's why I say I put some caution, but I'm not saying that the nationalist leaders are actually the cause. I put the responsibility on the government, because the government has right now the power, the authority to minimize this. Could, in fact, even, I point here in the paper that if there is any group or anybody to maybe change this situation in a short order, it's the government. If they change their policy, if they change their behavior, instead of, in fact, using more violence, if they open up, in fact, the political process, probably the situation would be improved. So the government, I agree with you, is responsible. And secondly, also, I think democratization. I think any challenge to undemocratic system, and it forces that system to open up the space, the democratic space. That's how, in fact, the democracy evolves. A democratic system takes root, has to be challenged. Governments, by their very nature, in fact, have a tendency to monopolize power. And once the leaders, in fact, almost under any circumstance, if they are not challenged, if there are no strong rules, regulations, and constitutions holding them back, they tend to build up their power at the expense of the people and at the expense of democratic processes. So challenge to the government, and particularly forcing the government to respect if there are constitutions, and those constitutions and implement them, opens up the process. And so nationalists in this case, if they are doing that, then definitely I think that's the goal. That's good, and eventually, in fact, probably out of this struggle, a more democratic system would come. But the fear is, well, on the other side, I think maybe even those who are opposed to this government, the incumbent Ethiopian government, there are many opposition groups, but the opposition groups are, in fact, in different on the opposite poles on some issues. They are opposing the government. In fact, it doesn't make all of them democratic or advancing, in fact, the cause of democracy. Some of them would probably even maybe perform worse than the current regime. I have some of, an example, some of the Abyssinian-oriented organizations who still yearn for bringing back the old order, which is even worse. Something, in fact, probably would never come back, but they still dream of that. I think that's not democratic, but the nationalists definitely, in fact, would probably really help in thinking about democratization if their goal succeeds. The other point, maybe very quickly, really, I think responding to your question about the role of Ethiopia in escalating violence and conflict in the region. I've alluded to that actually at the beginning of this. Ethiopia actually plays a big role in the conflicts going on the whole region. Maybe to some extent less in the Sudan, because they have not, at least in the decades, they have not actually directly clashed with the Sudan, or at least to a large extent. But look with, well, the war with Eritrea, look with the war with Somalia, and the repeated incursions into Somalia, whatever in fact is taking on there. And Ethiopia is contributing to that, fueling that violence. So Ethiopia is largely responsible, the Ethiopian government is largely responsible for it, although others have their own share. One thing actually I put in the paper but I didn't mention is this Ethiopian position. Let me just say in 1 minute. The Ethiopian government, this is in fact kind of a tradition of positioning themselves as the guardians or the friends of the West, the Western powers. This has been so with Menelik, and we all know, in fact, how he maneuvered them and positioned himself in Ethiopia, defender of Christianity, Christian civilization, and the arms that he received and used against the people. And in a way, echoes of that you see here now. How, in fact, the current regime is actually dealing with the issue of global terrorism and the war on terror, and positioning itself as an ally of the West, and in fact, indeed, to some extent convincing and receiving benefits to do that, although the government is actually doing its own job, not actually in the reality advancing the goals, the objective of the Western powers.